And thank you for joining us. It's our pleasure to welcome you to the third webinar organized by the Regional Partnership on Culture and Development. Today's webinar will take a look at the outcomes of the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development held last month in Rio de Janeiro. Specifically, the session will cover two main points. First, the outcomes of Rio+20, and second, the implications for the MENA region. It gives me great pleasure to welcome our presenter, Engineer Lama El Hatow. Lama is an environment and social specialist at the International Finance Corporation. She is a co-founder of the Water Institute of the Nile, as well as a climate policy officer at INDIACT. She attended Rio+20 last month as a civil society observer from Egypt on behalf of INDIACT. Today's webinar is expected to have around 20 participants from the RPCD Partnership Forum in Iraq, Morocco, Jordan, and Egypt. And it's an honor for me, Dalia Abul Futuh, Research Analyst for Natural Resource Management, to be with you. Kindly note that this webinar will last 45 minutes. Lama will have 30 minutes to present, leaving 15 minutes for questions and discussion among our distinguished participants. Last but not least, allow me to draw your attention to a few tools that will help the webinar proceed more smoothly. First, to ask a question or make a comment during the discussion, kindly press the raising hand icon located just above the participant box. You will be given the floor to speak in the order in which the requests were made. Second, to speak, switch on your microphone by pressing the talk button located just below the video box. Once you've finished, be sure to turn off the talk function to eliminate any echo and to ensure the clarity of sound. Third, on your left-hand side towards the bottom of the screen, you should find a chat box which can be used throughout the webinar to share comments or ask questions. Thank you, and I hope you have an enjoyable and fruitful webinar. I'll leave the floor to Lama.
Thank you, Dalia. Good afternoon, everyone, and Ramadan Kareem to you all across the MENA region. My name is Lama El Hatow, and I'm an environment and social specialist at the International Finance Corporation, a part of the World Bank Group. I also volunteer with INDIACT, which is an NGO based in Lebanon and Beirut, for Arab campaigning for climate policy and climate change. I'm a climate policy officer with them. I put my contact details below in my email in case anybody would like to contact me afterwards for any further questions. The presentation, as Dalia already mentioned, will be about 30 minutes, and then there'll be a Q&A session in the end. However, if anybody wants to necessarily ask a question in the middle, please feel free to raise the hand button, which is on the left-hand screen, and we'll get to it right as we can. Please feel free. This is a very interactive presentation, and I want everyone to feel as comfortable as possible. So without further ado, let's begin. Very briefly, the outline of this presentation. The background, I'll give a background on the Rio+20 Earth Summit and what it is. I'm sure everyone here is already very proficient with the UNCSD, United Nations Commission on Sustainable Development, and a lot of the issues, but I'll go briefly into that. I'll also be discussing the objectives of the summit and the major issues and a lot of the criticisms on the topics, such as the green economy, establishing the Sustainable Development Goals, which is one of the concepts that were intended to replace the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, post-2015. Other aspects including strengthening the institution of UNEP, the United Nations Environmental Program, to turn it into the UNEO, or the United Nations Environmental Organization. Managing our oceans, water and agriculture and natural resources, putting an end to fossil fuel subsidies, and of course finance, which is securing finance as a means of implementation. I'll actually focus on fossil fuel subsidies quite a bit, especially as it's something very concerning for both the MENA region and the Arab world, and what we're going through now with our Arab revolutions and the Arab Spring. And I'll give a case study at the end as well as how we can begin to move forward in the path forward for our countries in this region. In the end also I'll be discussing a little bit on the sidelines of Rio+20. As opposed to the official summit itself, there was a coinciding parallel summit by the People's Summit, and I'll discuss that briefly with a lot of the grassroots initiatives and innovations that came out and spawned out of that initiative, which were quite amazing. And of course, discussing how does Rio+20 actually affect us in the MENA region. It's something that seems to be very alien for a lot of people that are not necessarily environmentalists per se, and aware of something as Rio+20. But why should the common average Arab citizen in the MENA region be necessarily concerned with a summit that is taking place all the way in Rio, in Brazil, where so much is happening here in our region? So I'll give a little brief on that, on actually how pertinent, how relevant it is very much so to our region and what we're going through right now. And then, of course, lastly, I'll give you some recommendations and a path forward post Rio+20. So very briefly, the background of the Rio+20 Earth Summit. As a lot of you know, the Rio+20 is a part of the United Nations Commission on Sustainable Development, and it's the 20-year reunion from the very first Rio Earth Summit, which took place in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro, of course. The one that took place this year, the 20-year reunion, was in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil once again, and it took place from June 20th to 22, with preparatory meetings that commenced from the 13th of June, earlier on, and actually had commenced before that for at least 6 months, with draft texts being prepared and lots of negotiation processes beginning way before the actual summit took place in June. Slogan of the summit itself was, of course, the text for the future that we want, and how do we actually achieve that in terms of sustainable development. Trying to engage in all of the 3 pillars of sustainable development, which are environment, economy, and society. And how do we strike that balance between the 3 of them? A lot of people confuse that necessarily when that sustainable development necessarily means propagating the environmental issues and protection of environment and natural resources without adhering to and looking at economic livelihoods and income levels for poorer people. A lot of people disregard the social aspects behind it. This is actually precisely what sustainable development, however, is. It's trying to strike that balance between all 3 aspects at the same time. And that's what the Earth Summit was trying to do. So I'll go into a little bit on that later on. Now, for the conference themes, basically, there are 2 major conference themes per se for the summit. One of the first ones was the green economy, which I'm sure people have heard over and over and over again, as it was continuously propelled to us over the last 2 years. So in essence, it's how to build a green economy and to achieve sustainable development and lift people out of poverty, including support for developing countries that will allow them to find a green path for development. I'll get into this a little bit in the end, in how that necessarily does a green path for development or green growth per se, does it necessarily juxtapose another sustainable form of growth, or does green economy necessarily mean proper sustainable growth? I'll get into sort of the criticisms behind what green economy actually entails per se. And the second conference theme was how to improve international coordination for sustainable development by building an institutional framework. And this conference theme is very much focusing on the actual aspect of the UNEP, or the United Nations Environment Program, and how that's sort of been the body that has been chosen to replace, not necessarily replace, but to actually transform into an organization that has a legal authority and mandate and legislation that is, in fact, can provide this institutional framework for countries on sustainable development issues. Very briefly, can everyone hear me fine over here? Yes. Okay, I will, if there's any issues with the voice or the volume, yes, okay. Sounds like everyone can hear me fine. Okay, thank you everyone. If there are any issues, please just mention it in the chat box and we'll try and deal with any technical issues as soon as possible. So moving on, as I mentioned, some of the major issues being discussed are the green economy, and I'll get into a lot of that in detail actually. Fossil fuel subsidies, I'll get a lot into that. Establishing the Sustainable Development Goals post-2015 after the MDGs end. And I'll get into this one, of course. I'll get into all of these issues, but the first 2 are the ones that I'll actually be focusing on quite a bit, especially in relation to the MENA region. Strengthening, again, the UNEP to transform it into UNEO, or the United Nations Environment Organization. The means of implementation, or the finance aspects of Rio+20 and how that was dealt with. and of course managing oceans and natural resources. So let's start with the green economy. Very briefly, it's been highly criticized by a lot of NGOs in both developing countries, especially by AOSIS, which are the Alliance of Organization for Small Island States. The AOSIS has been very vocal in other UN fora, such as the UNFCCC, the Convention on Climate Change Convention, and other conventions as well, such as the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity. For obvious reasons, they are one of the largest regional blocs that are at most vulnerable to climate change impacts, to sustainable development issues. So they have been very vocal for a very, very long time regarding these issues specifically. They're one of the groups in the regional blocs that have highly criticized the green economy and how that's moved forward, along with civil society organizations and NGOs. For the very basic reason is in fact the green economy is just simply a greenwashing or a PR for a new form of capitalism. We're just replacing one sort of capitalist system or capitalist market mechanism with another and labeling it the green economy. And that's very much, Lama will try to raise her voice. Yes, okay, I will try to do that. Thank you. Yes, I was mentioning that one of the basic aspects of the green economy per se is in fact this valuation of nature, and how it is that we're necessarily meant through the concept of green economy to necessarily financialize nature and put an actual commodity and put an actual cost on natural resources. And this in itself is very problematic, in my opinion. Is it valuation of nature and natural resources necessarily for its protection, or is it again for its further exploitation? It could be necessarily misconstrued in a sense as attempting to transform nature into a commodity that is necessarily either consumed, it's tradable, it's preserved, but hence it's still at the end of the day a commodity. And do we necessarily want to do that with our air, our water, our natural resources? Do we necessarily want to do that with our forests? That's a big question that's being in debate currently on a global level. A lot of you will recall the UK Stern report that was released a couple of years ago on the cost of climate change. It actually began this process of looking at natural resources from this context, this cost-benefit analysis mentality, and how do we begin to necessarily look at commodifying our natural resources, and whether or not that the beginning of this process was good or not, that's something that's debatable. But he did in fact begin the whole discussion on whether or not we should begin to commodify our natural resources and put a value on it or not. Irrespective of all of these criticisms and all of these issues, the green economy, at the end of the day, even though it is the core issue, ironically, of the Rio+20 Summit, was disregarded and not included in the text in the outcome document at the end. And this is due to very much the fact that it was a very controversial issue, and hence there were too many issues to be dealt with, and was decided upon by world leaders that it would be dealt with at another session. So it was disregarded and not included in the text. Fossil fuel subsidies. Now, fossil fuel subsidies is one of my pet peeves personally. It's an issue that I've been following for a very, very long time. It's both on a national level here in Egypt, and on a regional level in the Arab world, and of course on a global level. It's been discussed in a plethora of forums, such as the G20 Summit, to the G8, to the UNFCCC, the UN Convention for Climate Change, and now to the UNCSD under Rio+20. And in all honesty, no one wants to deal with it. It's an issue that is the untouchable. It's an issue that everyone keeps throwing from fora to fora, and no forum really wants to deal with such an issue because it is such a contentious issue. It deals with the major businesses and major economics of our world system. Even the IMF, per se, the International Monetary Fund, has held several forums to actually necessarily deal with and attempt to discuss fossil fuel subsidies in terms of specifically for developing countries and for developed, and have all failed up until this point. And for very logical reasons. As I mentioned, it's a very contentious issue. But let me give you a brief, however, on what necessarily went on at Rio with the fossil fuel subsidies. So there was a poll, there was a global poll that took place about 2 weeks prior to the Rio+20 Earth Summit, where basically they asked citizens of the world to basically giving them a range of topics from everything from water to agriculture to green economy to all the different various issues dealing with sustainable development, and allowing them to vote on which one they felt was the highest priority issue that they thought that world leaders needed to tackle and had to tackle at Rio+20. And of course, the top of the list and the winner of the poll was in fact fossil fuel subsidies. So this was a very obvious poll, and this was a poll that was done on a global level, both developed and developing countries, poor and rich, everyone alike. And this was shown as the top of the poll as the top priority by all citizens from around the world to deal with by world leaders. Reason being is fossil fuel subsidies really has created a demand on a very cheap energy source, fossil fuels obviously, far beyond its actual true value of what it actually takes in terms of manufacturing, operation, transportation. Not just that, but it also necessarily pollutes the environment without any penalties to its users. In terms of penalties, this has again been attempted to be discussed in terms of carbon taxations and carbon taxes, certain mechanisms and market mechanisms to penalize those that necessarily will pollute more than others, but nothing legally mandated has been agreed upon, whether it be in the UNFCCC, in the Climate Change Convention, or other forums. Nothing has actually been agreed upon. So penalties are not in place, and hence the sort of solution by a lot of people has been to actually look at the root cause, which is in fact the subsidies for fossil fuels itself, creating this demand on a resource that is in fact very, very cheap. It also derails the market demand for renewable energies and doesn't allow for renewable energies and clean energies to have a competitive edge and advantage in the market, which is, again, not sustainable, whether it be for sustainable development, for green growth, for developing countries, for all those alike, which is a very big problem again. There was a huge civil society campaign that commenced in the middle of the Earth Summit in Rio that took place worldwide, basically to warn leaders. It was a mechanism between Twitter and Facebook and social media alike that took place, huge campaigns to warn world leaders towards the continuation of fossil fuel subsidies and how that would necessarily impact our people. As a result of all of this and all the dramas that propagated with fossil fuel subsidies and global polls and huge campaigns, the outcome of the text had absolutely no mention of fossil fuel subsidies whatsoever. And again, due to its controversy and its contentious issues, was postponed again to another session. It's almost like they're throwing the ping pong ball back and forth between forum to forum and state to state. The other major issues were in fact establishing the Sustainable Development Goals. Now this is a very new and very recent concept. The concept of Sustainable Development Goals was developed for Rio+20 at the Earth Summit, and this was a notion that was meant to replace, a mechanism that was meant to replace the Millennium Development Goals once they expired in 2015. The priority themes, however, is still being debated and still being outlined at this point in time. It has not been decided upon and was intended to be decided upon in Rio, but there was no agreement towards it, as there was a lot of controversy on how the themes itself would come about, and so there was no agreement towards the priority themes of the Sustainable Development Goals. But Rio did, in its text, mention that there would be a mechanism, and they would be the SDGs that would come to replace the MDGs post-2015. There were a lot of comments, however, made by many delegations that the concept of green economies per se should not in any way replace the SDGs, and that the two should move in parallel, and that a lot of people felt that there was a lot of similarities between the concept of green economies and the concept of SDGs, but that SDGs would be sort of the implementation tool or the mechanism by which green economies could actually move forward with. And that's why a lot of people felt that they should move in parallel as opposed to one necessarily replacing the other. The major fear behind this per se is the fact that we have not in Rio or beyond that been able to secure finance for green economies whatsoever, and hence can we necessarily be able to finance its counterpart of the SDGs? That's still a question mark behind that. The finance issue is always one that raises a lot of eyebrows. The next issue, which is UNEP, transforming it into UNEO, is one that has been discussed now for actually many years. There's been a root movement by many countries that there needs to be more legislation, more authority and jurisdiction that is given to a body, to an organizing body to necessarily to regulate how natural resources are managed and for sustainable development. UNEP, for its obvious root cause and objective, was selected to be the UN body that would necessarily be transformed into this legislative framework and provide for an institutional framework that could be turned into UNEO for this root cause. This, again, was criticized quite a bit for two main reasons. The first main reason was the fact that UNEO, many developing countries were actually objecting towards the fact that UNEO, the way that it would be organized, would be very global north monopolized, such as organizations such as the WTO, and hence a lot of the flaws that we see necessarily in world bodies such as the WTO would also be played out again in UNEO, and that's something that they didn't want to see happen once again. Another issue is the fact that the United Nations Environment Program, or the United Nations Environment Organization, doesn't necessarily encompass the entire three aspects of Sustainable Development Triangle, which are both environment, social, and economic sustainability, but only focuses on the environment. And how is it that we can go about necessarily changing that and transforming that to encompass all three together? This, again, was postponed. No assumptions or expectations were put on anybody at this point in time, and so this again was put in another session to be discussed. Finance. Finance is always a contentious issue in every body and in every UN discussion. Finance was discussed and it was put into the text, but very, very weak, with no commitments by countries, no commitments by developed countries or by developing or by anyone at this point in time. The major obstacle, of course, is who's going to fund the greening of developing countries' economies. Developing countries continue to use the argument, of course, of, we have a right to develop and we have a right to continue to grow, and if we are expected to move in a greener path, then so be it, but who necessarily will fund this? Who's going to provide the finances for it? And of course, the developed countries' argument continues to be, well, we are funding through a plethora of organizations and donor agencies, and more funds are being expelled from their states for sustainable development and environmental issues such as climate change. One more issue in terms of green economies is just more burden on their part. So that's the continuing debate again between developed and developing. Developing countries are looking and demanding for approximately 30 to 100 billion per year, US dollars, in exchange for greening their economies. So of course, as every other issue that was expected to be discussed in Rio, it was again postponed to another time. Major issues such as the oceans, water and agriculture. This was also discussed in a very, very weak manner. There was a text on water that placed commitments on developing countries, which was quite ironic, to address IWRM, Integrated Water Resource Management, but did not in any way place any commitments on developed countries, which was quite interesting. The whole argument here also came down to burden sharing and why necessarily should developing countries be required and asked to address certain issues without commitments on developed countries' part as well. There were statements of citizens' human right to water that was also placed into the text, but very negligently, without proper consideration at all. In terms of agriculture, land use and land use changes was postponed. They felt that it was not necessarily needed to be discussed in this forum and should be addressed in other fora such as the UNCBD or UNFCCC. Oceans, there was a good point on the oceans text. In fact, it was quite progressive, with the deep sea clauses for conservation and protection included in the text, and very strong. So there are some good points to hold out for the text in that respect. Other issues that that were also discussed, on in Rio+20. One of these is which is there was a strong comment that was made on the EU's recent move to change airlines for their greenhouse gas emissions. And for those of you that are unaware of this issue, basically the EU, the European Union, about 6 months to 1 year ago, propagated a policy whereby attempted to put a carbon tax on aviation, so that any airline that would actually exit or enter the European Union had to pay a certain carbon tax for its air emissions. And this is basically EU being the hub, the central hub for a lot of aviation and airlines across the world. This caused a lot of controversy, especially with the Chinese delegation. China was one of the states that was extremely outraged by this move on the EU, and for that reason specifically, they placed this clause in the text in Rio that stated that countries and regional blocs cannot take unilateral actions to deal with environmental challenges outside the jurisdiction of the importing country. Hence, if the EU wants to begin to propagate these kinds of policies within their own states, so be it, but it cannot be something that it imposes upon international countries on an international scene without their consensus. So that was something that was criticized by the EU in Rio. Private sector. Private sector was also an issue that was being discussed in Rio as well, where there was a lot of debate on whether or not we should actually begin to put requirements on corporations and big businesses to report and measure on their sustainability of operations. This was completely removed from the text by the fact that corporations and big businesses were very present and very much lobbying with vigor in Rio against this being in the text, and of course it was removed from the text. So what was in fact then the outcome of Rio+20? What did we get? What did we achieve? And this has been sort of it's basically, in a nutshell, the watered-down text that we did in fact achieve has achieved no real progress for any of the pillars or the main themes that we had hoped for in Rio+20. Many have thus doubted the effectiveness of the processes such as UNCSD and UNFCCC alike, and claim that they've failed us over and over again. Rio was also pegged as another Copenhagen, another COP15. For those of you that are aware or unaware, the UNFCCC COP15 negotiations in Copenhagen that took place in 2009 was a serious failure for the climate change negotiations. And again, Rio+20 is being pegged as another COP15 all over again. There was no ambitious agreement. There was nothing in Rio, and hence it was unable to solve any of the problems dealing with sustainable development or climate change or anything alike. Is this a problem? Yes, it is. We're beginning to see that these processes in of itself are very slow-paced, are lacking in their ambition, and are seriously lacking in any form of progress. A lot of people have begun to give up on these processes, but the truth is, and this is something that I truly believe, is that these forums, the UNCSD, the UNFCCC, are in fact the only legitimate forums that exist for multilateral talks that are inclusive of all states, whether it be big or small, rich or poor, developing or developed, small island states alike, or the larger polluters. These processes are the only forums that exist. You have other forums that discuss these topics on a much more smaller scale, the G20 summit, the G8, but none of them are inclusive of all states, and in fact take into consideration that it is in fact a consensus agreement whereby all states need to agree upon the resolutions completely. And this, of course, brings about extreme amounts of controversies. I mean, how can you be expected to have 192 parties or some states to agree upon certain issues dealing with such contentious issues of climate change and sustainable development when everybody has their own agenda in mind? And so, honestly, the truth be told is that you will always end up coming up with very, very vague declarations, such as that of Rio+20, that are simply the least common denominator between all states. And that is something that we will always end up seeing in these kind of processes, sadly so. Some of the issues that are continuously being brought up in every process, whether it be UNFCCC, UNCSD, UNCBD, is the growing debate between developed and developing countries. The issue of historical responsibilities by developed countries. They're the major emitters after the Industrial Revolution. They're the ones that started this problem of global warming. They're the ones that should be expected to pay. Or necessarily should we begin to also look at the new emissions development, such as new growing emitters such as China. China recently was one of the states that has passed the United States as being the largest emitter in the world. Do we begin to look at historical responsibilities by states such as the United States, or look at sort of also the new development growth of emissions for new developing countries? That continuous debate is in every single process. The finance debate is always being plagued, whether it's new money versus recycled money. The burden sharing equity debate, whether or not it's for a global good or for the CBDR prospect or principle. The CBDR is the common but differentiated responsibilities, which basically entails that all states are common in their responsibilities, but are always differentiated with respect to their entitlements of what necessarily those responsibilities are. And of course, again, the aspect of poverty reduction versus the right to develop. You will always end up finding developed countries pointing the finger at developing countries, saying you need to begin to grow in a sustainable manner. But then you end up having states like India and China with enormous amounts of poverty, still currently within their borders, claiming that they still have a right to develop. They still have a right to develop, and whether or not this can commence in a sustainable manner or not is debatable. So I put a couple of pictures that I took during the process to also lighten up this presentation a bit for you. This is a picture that was taken in UNCSD. This is where the Brazilian chair was clapping towards the draft text that was being adopted in the plenary session. There were a lot of boos that occurred in the back of the plenary session by civil society once this was adopted because of the nature of the draft text being as weak as it was. This again is the delegates as they huddle around the Brazilian chair, the presidency, the COP presidency, as they're attempting to reopen the draft text in the plenary session to attempt to improve it as much as possible. But as you can see, there was a failed attempt. Now, on the sidelines of Rio+20, there was, I'd like to go in a bit on how the responses to the outcome of Rio+20 and a little bit also on what happened on the sidelines. As I mentioned, the civil society and NGO community was very much outraged by the outcome of Rio+20, pegging it as another failure, another COP15, another Copenhagen altogether. A statement by the NGOs stated that NGOs here in Rio in no way endorse the document, and that a petition is being signed called The Future We Don't Want that completely refuses the document. NGOs demanded that the words "in full participation with civil society" be removed from the first paragraph of the text completely to exemplify their lack of representation in the process. These were very bold words that were being said, by the civil society community, and there was huge mass protests and rallies that erupted all over the world and in Rio from the outcome document. There was a huge condemnation rally that happened, and many people were very unhappy. Civil society actually conducted an action and wrote a document named "The Future That We Bought," whereby civil society had ripped up the text that named the future we bought to demonstrate their lack of acceptance to the capitalist dominance of negotiations over the global good. There's, in the next slide, I want to show you this picture. This picture was actually taken, I took this picture during the action that was taken in Rio+20. And as you can see, this is a document that civil society produced called "The Future We Bought," and basically exemplifying that, in fact, a lot of the bigger corporations and big businesses were the ones that were in control of the negotiations. And as you can see, there's a lot of the logos of big corporations and big businesses there on this document, exemplifying how they were the ones that were controlling the process and continue to control the process, and hence why there is no real results that can ever occur in these forums. So now on the sidelines of Rio+20, there were, very early on, many organizations realized that the official Rio+20 Earth Summit would fail to deliver on any ambition, and began to organize a parallel People Summit that would take place on the sidelines of the official summit. This would incorporate all marginalized groups, including the voices of indigenous persons, civil society, women's groups, all those that were left voiceless at the official summit itself. There were a lot of activities that were ranging from anti-nuclear campaigns to forest preservation. A lot of information was shared and knowledge sharing during these, a lot of seminars, a lot of booths, actually, very innovative solutions were being propagated in some of these booths where to show ingenuity and grassroots movements, where some of these booths were powered by cycling for sustainable energy, so they were powered solely by the cycling of people. scrap materials. Motorcycles were constructed entirely out of scrap material and waste products to demonstrate how, in fact, we can begin to not necessarily recycle, but reuse our products in a very efficient manner. So there were a lot of innovative solutions that were coming out of People's Summit and out of these grassroots movements, and showing how that whatever the outcomes of the Rio+20 official summit will be, that regardless of whatever comes out, that they will continue in their efforts and that they will continue with their grassroots movements, and that domestic work will continue to happen on a local level no matter what. This is a picture that was taken actually as well, also at the People's Summit, showing one of the booths that was powered by some of the cyclists powering the booth. So now, how necessarily does the Rio+20 official Earth Summit affect the MENA region? And this is something I wanted to discuss in a little bit of detail. Now, for the very obvious reasons, the MENA region is a very, in terms of climate change impacts and vulnerabilities, it is going to be one of the most vulnerable regions to be impacted by climate change and by sustainable development and desertification and water scarcity. All the issues that we're very familiar with as environmentalists. But if the issue is not necessarily just environmentalists per se, how can we begin to attract the common citizen in any of our countries in the MENA region, in the Arab world, to be interested in a summit that is all the way in Rio? And that's something that I actually wanted to really bring home to you today, is that a lot of what's happening in the Arab world currently with the Arab revolutions and the Arab Spring, a lot of the words that are being propelled in the streets of bread, freedom, and social justice, some of these main words, I would actually argue that the Rio+20 summit and a lot of the issues that are being discussed, the core issues of it, have everything to do with, in fact, the very pillars by which our revolution started. And I think one of those major debates is, in fact, the fossil fuels debate. If we begin to look at social welfare and equity, a lot of these reasons, some of the major reasons by which the revolutions began, are also some of the major issues by which what Rio was necessarily discussing. Now, if we look at specifically the fossil fuels debate, and you'll have to forgive me if I have a little bit of an Egyptian-centric focus here on some of the statistics and information I have here, due to my background and obviously knowledge and work on fossil fuel subsidies for the past coming years. It will become a little bit Egyptian-centric. So my apologies for our other Jordanian, Moroccan, and other colleagues from around the world for that reason. In Egypt specifically, you'll find that actually the case of Egypt will become very similar to those in a lot of your other states, I'm sure. But in Egypt specifically, fossil fuel subsidies demonstrates an 80-20 disparity. And what we mean by this is that 80% of the subsidies that are directed towards fossil fuels goes to actually service only the upper 20% of the Egyptian population. Now, this is a very, very, very big problem in of itself. Fossil fuel subsidies initially began in order to be able to cater to the lower income groups that were at a poorer risk and were unable to necessarily cater for their own needs for poverty reduction purposes. So when we come out with statistics like this, and this study, by the way, was conducted by the World Bank in 2005, to be able to determine this disparity, the 80-20 disparity that we talk about here. So when we come to discover that, in fact, we realize that 20%, the upper 20% of the Egyptian elite are the only ones that are being catered to this, it's a very big problem. In of itself, subsidies have been servicing in Egypt the heavy energy industries such as steel, cement, fertilizers, where its commodities are being exported to foreign markets. So we're essentially subsidizing energy for rich businessmen, and we're subsidizing commodities for foreign markets, which is a very inefficient use of our resources. Egypt spends about 10 to 20% of its government spending on subsidies, accounting for approximately 80 to 100 billion Egyptian pounds per year, which is, again, a huge, enormous amount. In the midst of a current energy crisis that's going on currently in the country, since June 2012, people in Egypt will notice power cuts, rationing, long petrol lines at gas stations. The fossil fuel subsidies debate has always been extremely contentious, basically due to the fact that any form of protest could arise from the fact that if fossil fuels were necessarily removed, that this would erupt in massive explosive protests across the Arab world, from food prices and but lack of social equity and welfare. But I would like to actually argue that, in fact, if we look at fossil fuel subsidies itself, it's in fact has gone to cater those that necessarily don't need it. that in fact, how do we begin to look at this debate, and how do we begin to look at fossil fuel subsidies and transform the mechanism by which it's implemented to actually cater for those that need it the most, and do it in an effective manner that also does allow for sustainable development and competitive advantage for renewable energies, of the like. How do we begin to do that? And there are solutions, and I'm going to give a case study, actually, example in one of the coming slides on how that necessarily can be done, because there are effective and quite very successful ways that that can be done. But before I get into that, I'd also like to relate how green economy impacts the MENA region as well specifically. I've talked a little bit about whether or not green is always good in this aspect of valuing nature, or valuation of nature in terms of economics and the financialization of it. In my opinion, I think a shift to a greener economy per se is needed, regardless of whatever the label is per se. If we're talking green or blue or whatever the label is, having states, and especially in the MENA region, begin to look at green legislation and enforcement really needs to occur. Our laws are very, very meager if they do exist, and especially their enforcement of the legislation is problematic. So I think a shift to a greener thinking per se, whereby both environment, social, and economic issues discussed together in unison, is something that really needs to be at the forefront in the MENA region. I truly believe that instead of using market instruments that commodify our environment, that we really need to enforce the notion of citizenship after the Arab Spring especially. I think this is something that would really propel us forward. Now, looking at recommendations for a path forward, processes, again, as we mentioned, like the UNCSC, UNFCCC, and UNCBD have proven to be somewhat problematic and slow-paced and somewhat of a failure, but I would also argue that they've only really truly progressed due to the pressure applied by civil society groups from around the world. And hence we need to continue to apply pressure. We need to continue to work on both an international level and a domestic level. The domestic work needs to begin to progress also to empower our local groups and communities to work and to make citizens aware of what is actually occurring on a local level. So both this parallel work needs to occur on an international and a domestic level. We also need to learn from case studies and examples and successes from around the world to be applied domestically and how we can begin to use them. And here I'm actually going to give a little bit of a case study example on Iranian model, which is very ironic because when we talk about the MENA region, many of you will be very aware that in fact Iran, or the Iranian model per se, is not one that we tend to look at as one that we would like to copy per se in terms of as a success story. But looking at specifically the fossil fuel subsidies debate, you'll actually see that the way that it was implemented was in fact very unique, but also very, very successful in the way that it was done. And I'll get into that now. Again, before I get into it, I would like to note very quickly that the dynamics, I'm fully aware of a state of countries such as Iran will vary considerably from states such as Egypt and Jordan and Morocco alike. But I would also argue that the basic principles here will be adhered to no matter what the case is. So this is a very, very, very long case study, and I won't get into it considerably. I'll just give you the highlights of it. Basically what Iran did was it instigated a cash compensation mechanism for the citizens before removing the subsidies completely. So instead of doing a gradual removal of fossil fuel subsidies, it did a one-shot complete removal, but with a cash compensation. So let's say, for example, in Egypt, 100 billion is being spent on fossil fuel subsidies. If you take 100 billion with 85 million persons in Egypt population, divide that by its population, you get, let's say it's about £1,000 per person per year. Divide that by number 12 months, and you get a certain amount that would be dissipated and would actually be given to each person per month. Now, what Iran necessarily did is what you would do is the first cash compensation would be a lump sum of 3 months in advance to incentivize the citizens and motivate them that they would be getting a large slot of cash at one shot. You'd also be ensuring that all citizens then would have to receive the cash compensation, must open up bank accounts in their countries, whereby the money would be transferred into directly. This enhances, number one, the financial sector and the banks in your market, forces the citizens to get registered for national ID in order to get a bank account to begin with. So you're ensuring transparency and accountability for your citizens. You're also tying the cash compensation to some form of social welfare for the enhancement of the citizens. So let's say, for instance, that you put a restriction that the cash compensation will only be given unless there are medical health checks, or every year, or that you necessarily enroll your children in school. So there's a social welfare tied into it, whether it be education or health or etc. in whatever sector you would like. you also have to show the citizens immediately that the money saved from the removal of fossil fuel subsidies goes to service the citizens in some national-wide infrastructural project immediately. Something that's visible to them that they can actually use and impact them directly. Something like a massive new subway system or a road infrastructure project, something that they can actually visibly see. And then you roll out the campaign, the massive media campaign, prior to the removal of the subsidies by at least 6 months, to educate the people on all the aspects of the policy and how it was done. Now this specific factor here was the major successor for Iran and how it was so successful in that country. Lastly, what you would do is once you have massive buy-in to the policy, you basically come to ask and request that the upper 20 percentile of your population relinquish their rights to the cash compensation to better service the national projects. In Iran, the majority of the upper percentile was actually willing to do so, and in fact did that. So there was an additional amount of money that was saved that went, again, to service the national project. Again, I'd like to note that this was extremely successful in Iran, and no country and no model is copy-paste. But we can look at some of the basic principles of how, in fact, this success story came out to be and learn from their models to begin to utilize it in our countries. So lastly, as a path forward, I'd like to note that some of the Iranian dynamics, again, differ from MENA countries, but the principles can be adhered to. We need to empower and include civil society in our decision-making process as much as possible, and we need to learn from the grassroots initiatives and innovations that took place from around the globe. Rio+20 really did show us that, in fact, some of the grassroots initiatives have very, very surprisingly been a lot more successful than some of the more international policy-making decisions that were being taken in the official summit. And lastly, we really need to continue to apply pressure on both our governments, domestically and internationally, for legally ambitious agreements for sustainable development. I'd like to thank you for your attention, and if anybody has any questions, please feel free to do so. If anybody has any questions, you can type into the chat box, or you can just raise your hand with the icon on the left-hand side, and our moderator will be very kindly to assure whoever comes in each order.
Yusra, please ask your question.
Yusra, you can use the talk button if you like, just talk into the mic directly, or if it doesn't work for your PC, if there's no mic, then you can type in your question into the chat box, whichever one you prefer. Yes, please type your question, that's fine.
Malik, can you ask your question, please, till we get Yusra's question in the chatting box? Malik, you can start talking.
Yes, hello. My question, can you hear me? My question is about the Egyptian case. How would you think that the new government should proceed to remove the fuel subsidy? And do you really think that what we call subsidy in this sense is a true subsidy? Because in the Egyptian case, the price differential is between the production and international price. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you.
you, Malik, for your question. And actually, it's a very good question. You're right. There's a lot of problems with necessarily fossil fuel subsidy removal here in Egypt per se. And you're right in terms of production and cost and looking at the international market difference. You're right, there is a big problem with that. I've been working on fossil fuel subsidies for some time now, and we've been attempting to get it actually noticed by Mr. Hisham Anzib, the new Prime Minister, and by the current government that is going into power at this point in time. There's been several discussions, especially about a month ago, with necessarily beginning to remove 20%. There was an initial approval by Parliament to have a budget cut for 27% in order to begin to remove fossil fuel subsidies. And this was approved by Parliament. It was not implemented as of yet because of political problems that are engaged with Parliament, and it's dissolving. But politics aside, this is being discussed, and it is being discussed quite considerably, especially on the level of the industrial sector. A lot of people feel that necessarily the industrial sector, especially the energy-intensive industries, should not, in fact, be getting any of these fossil fuel subsidies whatsoever. The same can also be said in certain aspects to some of the agricultural sector, whereas some of these large agribusinesses and corporations should not necessarily be getting some of these subsidies and being catered to. So there is a lot of discussion occurring currently on whether this should be done in a coupon system, whether it should be done for those that cater to those that need it the most, the more underprivileged. Should we look at different mechanisms of having a rationing system per se? How is it that we can actually begin to do that? So that's still being discussed. But in my opinion, I think that we can begin to learn, again, I think that we really, really can learn from the Iranian model. And I think that we need to begin to transform the way that we look at fossil fuel subsidies as a dire need, or not necessarily as a dire need, but as a God-given right to Egyptian citizens. Because again, those that necessarily are the ones that are being serviced by it, are not those that really need it. And that's, I think, in my opinion, extremely problematic. Yes, I just got your question, and for everyone that reads, I would like to know what are the future steps and actions being suggested by the presented NGOs during the Rio+20 Summit. It's a good question. There was a huge document actually that was produced that came out by civil society and NGOs group, and I can, if you like, maybe circulate it to the people on the email list afterwards. I can give it to Ms. Dagab al-Futuh and to others if they would like to circulate it to amongst you. It's a very big document, and this was prepared at least 6 months prior to Rio+20, and something that was in the process of being discussed with NGOs and civil society groups around the world. Everybody from Greenpeace to WWF, World Wildlife Fund, to Oxfam, to WRI, the World Resources Institute, various NGOs and groups around the world, including INDIAC, of course, being one of them, Climate Action Network, CAN International, all came together and produced a document that was given to world leaders and to delegations around the world in preparation to Rio+20, as when necessarily were the demands in Rio+20 and how it is that we would like it to move forward. And it included everything from green economy to the criticisms of green economy, to looking at fossil fuel subsidies and how that should be discussed, to looking at oceans and natural resources, to all the various issues that I discussed in my presentation. There was very, very detailed descriptions on how those specific issues needed to move forward, and unfortunately, none of that happened in the outcome document. I'd like to give the floor if there are any more questions by anyone. Please feel free to ask them.
Thank you very much for the presentation. You said Iranian is a good model and we can apply it in the MENA region. I have a question. What you think the point that may be restricted to apply this model in Jordan compared with or in the MENA region? What are the points and how we can convey the government to go and apply this model? Thank you.
Thank you, Noan, for your question. It's a very good question, and you're right. Not every model, not every success story can be applied to any other country. It's definitely not a copy-paste. I fully agree with that. And every country has a different dynamic, and every country has a different domestic circumstances that would differ it from every other country. So it's not necessarily where the Iranian model can be necessarily taken as it stands and be applied as a copy-paste. Definitely not. I don't think that that is necessarily the case and should not in any way be the case. But if we look at some of the aspects and factors that made the Iranian model successful, I think that we can necessarily learn from them. I think that if we use something such as the media campaign that they attempted to do, I think that that was a very successful tool that they looked at. It's a form of making the people aware that, in fact, fossil fuel subsidies, and this is something I really believe could be done both in Egypt and in Jordan and everywhere else in the MENA region, because this one factor as well was very, very successful. It's about awareness. It's about education. Because when you begin to educate the common citizen that, in fact, the subsidies that are being provided to you by your government are not, in fact, servicing you in any way at this point in time. In fact, they are going to cater and to service the big businessmen, the corporations, to commodities that are being exported to foreign markets. They're going to service those that live in Europe and in the United States. They are going, but no way are these subsidies that your government is spending enormous billions of pounds on, in no way are these actually coming to actually service you. This really needs to be educated and be told to the actual consumer and the actual user on the streets. So that kind of education really needs to occur. That kind of awareness really needs to occur. And so that factor by which Iran did, the huge media campaign for education and awareness, with policies and questions that continue to occur, that's something I think we really could learn from. I really also very much have to applaud the Iranian model for certain mechanisms, like, for instance, the aspect of tying it to social welfare. They restricted the cash compensation. They basically said that any cash compensation can only occur unless it happens, and then they tied it, in their instance, they tied it to education. So they said that every family, every household family, the father needs to enroll all of his children into schools. So you tied it to education. We can here in Egypt tie it to healthcare, for instance, in our healthcare system. We can also tie it to education. You begin to make sure that you're not just giving them back a bulk of cash compensations to enhance their income and livelihoods just for their own purposes so that they can do what they will with it, but making sure that they will also in some way tie it to a social welfare benefit that in fact will also enhance and empower the citizens as well. And that's something I think is very, very important. That's something that I really, really applaud the Iranian government in doing as well in that aspect. So again, once again, to repeat, I don't think that we can take the entire model of what the Iranians did. Again, they're an oil-rich country. We are not. From my understanding, neither is Jordan. So those kinds of dynamics are very, very different. But let us learn, I think, from a lot of what they did do, and I think that we can apply them very, very successfully here in our own countries. I think there were others that also wanted to ask a question. You can start talking whenever you feel, whenever you have a question. Please go ahead.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks and appreciate for this presentation. Actually, personally, I was not aware about this event in Rio de Janeiro, so you added a lot of information and we are now aware about this ongoing. Thanks, appreciate. Actually, I have no questions. I just like to add and comment that if this kind of topics is important from like for other states for the MENA region, it is important more because it's related to the natural resource. As we know that the MENA region is very rich area with oil and gas and agricultures, and this kind of topics are related very well to the case of stability and peace and war. The good advantage that you have with the Arab Spring may well add and contribute to provide a better and sustainable economy, because the very good and the developed economy without respecting the human right and democracy, it's not adding any kind of welfare to the society. As we have a success story and a good example in the world, which is the Norway case, that the natural resources, oil and gas, how much serving the citizens through access to health care and access to just and other kind of services like education. So for that, this kind of topics is very important for us from point of sustainable development, economy, and providing the peace and stability in the region. And second issue, I like it if you can add more about it. What about the alternative energy? As we know that the MENA region is sunny countries, sunshine regions. We can use the sun to alternative energy and keeping our society in green and away from pollution. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. I fully agree with you, and I think that we have a lot of natural resource potential in this region as well that we can really benefit from. But I think necessarily if we can begin to do it in a very sustainable manner and not exploit it, then I really believe that we have a lot to add in this region as well. And especially on the energy aspect as well, I fully agree with you. As I see, I think we have a question here from Heba. I'll read it out. Heba Nasir has said, I didn't get exactly why the NGOs was not satisfied with the conference and what they presented in the Future We Bought document. Thanks. Thank you, Heba. Actually, I think that, sorry, I might have misrepresented that in my question, in when I was talking in my discussion. The Future We Bought document actually was it was a sarcastic note. I'll actually go to that slide. Maybe you can see it also here. Here it is. This document was not the document. Okay, I think I might have confused you when I was speaking. So there was a document that was produced during Rio+20. After the outcome document came out by the official summit. And that document is called The Future We Bought. And it's basically saying, it's a sarcastic joke basically, kind of by civil society, that basically said that because big corporations, and from the logos here you can see Nestle, Shell, ExxonMobil, Caixa, all these big General Motors, these are the big companies and big corporations and big businesses around the world. Basically what this Future We Bought document says is it's a prank, basically showing that the people that were actually responsible for the negotiations in Rio+20 was not in fact the delegations in the countries around the world, but big businesses in their lobbying. And because the entire process failed in their opinion in Rio+20, it was because of these big companies, not because governments were adhering to the livelihoods of their citizens. So I think I might have confused you with that. The second document that I was discussing briefly before was a document that was produced prior to Rio+20 by at least 6 months, and this was not called The Future We Bought. The Future We Bought is a joke. It's a joke document. This other document, so the document that was produced by civil society from around the world I can't remember the exact name of it right now, but basically it was a document looking at, I think it's public policy statements for Rio+20 or something like that. And it's basically all policy initiatives by which we want world leaders to begin to adhere to at Rio+20. Now, I think your question is why were NGOs unhappy with the outcome documents? The outcome documents basically from Rio+20 it really didn't say anything. It didn't, if we're looking for addressing aspects of climate change, it didn't. If we're looking at addressing aspects of fossil fuel subsidies, it didn't. If we're talking about who's going to finance green economies, it didn't. If we're talking about how to preserve our water and natural resources, it didn't. If we're talking about how to properly define the Sustainable Development Goals, it didn't. So what did Rio+20 do? Really not much. So that's, I guess, in a very, very simplistic way, answer your question of why were NGOs unhappy with the outcome document, because it didn't set out to do any of the objectives of what it initially was meant to do. I hope that answers your question. If it doesn't, please let me know and I'll try and clarify some more.
If there's no more questions, then I'll quickly wrap up. I'd like to thank you all once again for your participation. I hope that you enjoyed the webinar and found it informative and useful. I also have a small announcement to make before closing the session. RPCD is soliciting applications for our upcoming conference titled Citizen-Led Innovation and Social Change Practices During Periods of Transition from October 9 to 11 in Nicosia, Cyprus. Successful applicants will be invited to attend with all expenses paid. And if you're interested or think someone from your organization would be interested, please send an email to hmorgan@fhi360.org, and I'll write that in the chat box. All right, thanks everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Once again, thank you everybody, and if you have any questions or any further comments, you have my contact below. It's lelhatow@gmail.com. I'll write it again in the chat box, and feel free to contact me if you have any further questions or queries. Thank you for your time. Bye.
I just want to write this one thing first.